Welcome back to the Wallace Branch, and today we're shifting locations and working our way up the Burke Branch, which extends northeast from Wallace, Idaho, for around 7 miles. The main topics of our work today are the Mammoth-Standard Mill, which is located at the start of the branch line, and then the Mammoth-Standard Mine itself, which is located almost 4 miles up. We'll also be tackling the little town of Gem, Idaho, which, like Burke, Idaho, had tracks running up its main street, as well as some fun little outhouses on stilts directly above Canyon Creek. From the beginning of this route, I felt that the Burke Branch would be one of the most difficult parts because of its confined spaces, its extensive mine structures that mostly no longer exist. So basically I put this off for as long as possible. I didn't even put in the Canyon Creek or the tracks when I did the rest of those for the main east-west portion of the route. And so in other words, I did a whole 60 miles of tracks and creeks at the beginning, but left out this section. So yeah, I put the whole thing on the shelf for the end. Researching this area, it took me a while to figure out that the Mammoth-Standard Mill, which served the mine, was located in this odd little corner of a hill right by Wallace. Even though the Sanborn map of Wallace includes it as a side box, I didn't realize it was so close to Wallace. It's a tight spot, and once I had the asset in place, it took a while to kind of excavate the buried parts of the complex. Fortunately, in creating the asset and laying out the track, the Sanborn maps have a lot of detail, and there are plenty of photos from both the uphill and downhill sides of this building complex. It seems that the mill could be served by both the Northern Pacific and the Union Pacific, but I'm not really 100% sure on that. Anyway, the NP line goes up the west side of this canyon, and then the UP goes along the east side. For the two Mammoth-Standard complexes, the mine and the mill, I used these old Sanborn maps and a mix of photos, trying to get the buildings as close to the prototype as possible. Most of the mine and concentrator buildings have a pretty uniform look. They're made of wood siding, shingle or slate roofs, and lots of windows. And sometimes the amount of windows looks over the top, doesn't correspond to the way we think of industrial buildings nowadays. And definitely different from today's mining buildings that essentially don't have windows. As I've speculated in the past, I think that back in the day, windows let in light when electricity was expensive and required a lot of costly deliveries of coal. On the Sanborn insurance maps, most of the complexes have their own power plant buildings, and they would have been very inefficient power plants. Light bulbs weren't that bright back then, and this work was dangerous. So for all the wooden buildings, I used a fairly uniform set of PBR textures and an opaque glass material for all the windows. My main learning early on, since I was new at PBR, was that you want to keep the displacement channel, in other words, the alpha channel of the normal map, very minimal or just plain white for these big buildings, because displacement on the roof and walls will cut into the geometry in a very unrealistic way, and it even exposes the things that are underneath. PBR normal maps will also cause some of the undersides of the buildings or the structures to disappear completely, so I felt it was necessary to mix one text with PBR to avoid that sort of thing. And I think probably one text loads faster too. On the upper part of this mill structure, I added some narrow gauge track splines, most of which are under sheds. It's not really clear to me if the narrow gauge track extended all the way back up the canyon in parallel with the tracks. Anyway, there might have been aerial tramways as well, as in the case of the Hercules. I'm just not sure. In the next part, I started detailing the wide part of the valley where the current town of Woodland Park is located. I had already put down some scrapbook assets of the trailer park and a few houses, and then I came back later and filled in a little bit more, but it's the same theme. This part of the valley was once a tailings pond where a wooden dam held the tailings back from running into the Coeur d'Alene. Now there are these gigantic covered tailings piles located in the valley, and they're big enough to be a major presence on the Trainz dam profile. And as with the big tailings pile in the Kellogg area, I opted to create a big black mound rather than a swampy, polluted wasteland. For the town of Gem, I mostly used off the DLS assets. I started with a Dave Snow city block, but then I had to delete that because it was just too large. I used a mix of older and newer looking buildings, and a lot of the houses have just dirt yards, I think. This was a pretty gritty town. Later, I came back and used a less pristine looking highway spline for the main street. So far in creating this route, all the road assets I've placed down have no traffic, and it's one of the things I'm not looking forward to fixing a little bit later. The handful of invisible road traffic splines I've experimented with all have these very low poly cars that I don't really like. And traffic is one of those tedious things that a lot of route builders probably just ignore. And so far, I guess I've fallen in line with that stereotype, but eventually I'm hoping to come back to that, along with the signals. Of course, this road through town might be especially challenging, so maybe it's best to just not have any traffic here. And of course, we have these outhouses on stilts hanging out over the Canyon Creek, which was sometimes known back then as the Little Nasty. Next, we're moving further uphill to the Mammoth-Standard Mine Complex. The actual mine shaft was a bit uphill of the valley bottom, and it seems there was a tramway connecting it to the mine structures down in the bottom. It's quite a complex, which you'll see in the background because I used the Barnard Stockbridge photos as references, as well as the Sanborn map for the ground plan. I'm just going to show some bits and pieces of the build, which is fundamentally similar to many other mining buildings on the route. In reality, I think that even on 6x time lapse and without having recorded every part of the build, there were still 3 hours of video, which I basically just shortened down to around 20 minutes. Again, I'm shooting to give you kind of a complete overview, but not show everything. And in this part, I'm just focusing on a few of the first buildings that I built, and then the ore chute, the power plant, and the log retaining wall that's so prominent in the photos. Feel free to skip ahead if it seems repetitive, though. This part is the main building, the upper level of the main buildings. Then here in this section, I'm starting with the ore chute area, which has a lot of gigantic stilts or pilings that extend down to the track level. This seems to be one of the power plant type buildings. I decided to vary the color to be a little bit more red, but it's not necessarily based on anything. Bit of background, the standard group of claims was located on May 7th, 1885. And in the early years, production figures for Mammoth and Standard were recorded separately, so there were two companies initially. If the production, however, from both properties were combined for the initial years, it would have easily been the district's most valuable producer at almost half again as much as the largest producer, Bunker Hill Mine. The Mammoth-Standard Mine consisted of underground workings, including a single shaft. The maximum distance of the underground workings was approximately 661 meters, or 2,170 feet, while the ore body itself extended for a length of 1,200 feet. It was operated by the Standard Mining Company as well as the Mammoth Mining Company up until 1903, at which point it became the Federal Mining and Smelting Company, which was based in New York, and that continued on to 1953. And it also began production again briefly in the 1960s before shutting for good. In terms of production, it actually produced about 200 to 250 million pounds of lead, about 12 to 15 million ounces of silver, and about 12 million to 15 million pounds of zinc. I looked up how that compares with the largest lead and zinc mines in the United States today. The largest one is in Alaska. It's the Red Dog open pit mine. It's currently the largest zinc mine in the world. And Red Dog produces almost as much lead in 1 year as the Mammoth Standard did in its whole time of operation. And the Red Dog also could produce the same amount of zinc in 10 years as the Mammoth Standard did in its whole lifetime. In contrast, the Lucky Friday mine, which still operates in Mullen, Idaho, that's producing 19.5 thousand tons of lead per year, or around 40 million pounds. So it will top Mammoth's cumulative lifetime lead production in about 5 years. So while you might think that all of these closed mines in the Silver Valley mean that the US just doesn't produce minerals anymore, that's just definitely not the case. Mines today, they have to be larger to stay globally competitive. That's at least my amateur interpretation. There are a ton of mines, pun intended, in this area, so I wanted to know something about why there is such a concentration of ores in this part of the Pacific Northwest. Basically, what I learned is most of this part of Idaho and western Montana is made up of the Belt Supergroup, and that comprises rocks that were initially deposited on the land on the supercontinent of Rodinia, basically from 1.5 to 1.4 billion years ago. In Glacier Park to the east, most of the Belt Supergroup rocks were deposited on land in an arid climate, but in the Wallace Block, it seems that the sediments were deposited in the bottoms of lakes or shallow seas. After Rodinia broke up, the whole region became a continental margin, and as different islands and other chunks of crust called terrains smashed into North America, the region became uplifted, heavily faulted, and also affected by volcanism. Veins formed through which minerals collected and lithified, and there were 6 periods of mineralization that took place. Over 3 widely spaced periods, the late Proterozoic, the late Cretaceous, and the Tertiary. However, the ore-bearing veins were formed probably in the late Proterozoic times. In other words, at least 500 million years ago, with most of the lead being around that age. A lot of the veins are thin, maybe even less than 1 meter thick. They were squeezed in at high temperatures up to 350 degrees Celsius along the weak intersections of steeply tilted plains of ancient sediment. I found it interesting that President Henry L. Day, who was the owner of the Day Mines Company, which owned a lot of the mines in the area, he wrote about this geological history in his 1963 assessment of the future of the region's mining economy. And he also noted the rising cost of mining over time and how uncertain commodity prices made it difficult to predict whether this mining economy would continue to thrive. And he estimated or posited that silver would need to sustain $2 per troy ounce in 1963 terms. Inflation adjusted, that's more like $44 today. So in other words, it would have to be nearly twice the present silver price. Of course, we don't know what the cost would be like now. And he had a similar analysis for lead and zinc, and my interpretation is that minerals prices are too low for those minerals at least. But of course, there is one mine operating in the area, so it's not uneconomical across the board. The log retaining wall I decided to make as a large mesh asset. The color, in my opinion, ended up a little bit too uniform, so for the other retaining walls, I used a PBR log wall texture instead. The color of the sand texture for the mesh on top of the log retaining wall, that also doesn't really match perfectly with my other sand texture, but it's okay. The mine was another difficult asset to place into the map, given that the railroad is already on a steep grade here. The result for now is that the railroad grade flattens a bit and then gets extremely steep right after the mine. It's another asset where I ended up having to do some excavation to unearth the asset from its location. Probably the landform has changed shape a bit since the mine closed. There was a bit of a town around the mine, along with some more of those fun outhouses. I think some people had to exit their back door, cross the railroad tracks, just to go take a dump. And yeah, it's not really the kind of thing that you usually look for in real estate. And of course, you had a lot of sheds, yard office type buildings, all scattered around. And there you have it. The Burke Branch is basically sketched in about halfway at least, including the Mammoth-Standard Mill at the bottom, the tailings piles, the town of Gem, and then this Mammoth-Standard Mine complex. I know this was a long episode and some parts may have seemed a bit repetitive, so thanks for sticking with me. Next, we'll be polishing off the Burke Branch, at least I hope so, starting with the gigantic concrete structure of the Hecla Star Mine, which still stands today, and then modeling out the exciting ghost town of Burke, Idaho, which is at the head of the canyon and at the end of the Burke Branch. We're getting close to completing the route, so stay tuned, like and subscribe, and we'll see you again next time on the Wallace Branch.